Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria Gracie.
And I'm Eve Gracie. Welcome to Women Empowered Live, where we gather with our community to discuss effective tools and strategies to develop our sense of physical, psychological, and emotional safety.
Because we believe that when we feel safe, we're more likely to take risks, embrace freedom, and live an empowered life.
Today, we are going to be examining abusive relationships and taking a deeper dive into understanding domestic violence. And for this conversation, we have invited Catherine Kunicek. Catherine is a licensed clinical social worker and a therapist and outreach specialist for Family Crisis Services, a domestic violence and rape crisis center in Cañon City, Colorado. She is also a Gracie certified Women Empowered Instructor for Gracie Jiu-Jitsu Cañon City and a mental health consultant and instructor for Uncaged Today, a nonprofit which harnesses the healing benefits of self-defense to assist women who have been victims of violent crime. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today for this really important topic. Awesome. So Catherine, can you start off by just telling us a little bit about your background and what led you to the path of where you are today in terms of supporting survivors of domestic violence?
Absolutely. So I grew up in small town Wyoming and pursued my undergrad at Tulane University in New Orleans. And while there was a victim of a sexual assault that occurred during my freshman year, and through that healing process, started to work with operating phone lines for a crisis center locally that assisted specifically domestic violence, sex assault, and stalking victims within college campuses. And that really led me then to the work of domestic violence. I pursued my master's in social work at the University of Denver to further that education, and then became a licensed therapist after that. So I've been working with victims and survivors of sex assault and domestic violence since 2009. And that's a little bit about what brought me to this work. The self-defense side of it, I was approached by a local jiu-jitsu and Krav Maga enthusiast who wanted to talk to me about training with victims of crime. And we started partnering together to see what that might look like. And then through that, she developed a nonprofit that is solely dedicated to teaching female victims of crime self-defense. So that's what led me on that journey. And then through her, got super involved with Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and now I'm an instructor. So it's been a cool journey.
We're lucky to have you.
We are. We're really excited about the work you guys are doing. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Can we just kind of take a look at the landscape of when we talk about intimate partner violence or domestic violence? What are, statistically speaking, how common is this? How prevalent is this, maybe both within the United States and within the world? What kind of numbers are we looking at for this?
So in terms of the United States, approximately 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner. So that translates to about 10 million men and women that are abused by an intimate partner during the course of a year. With the statistics, women are more likely to be victims of domestic violence and sex assault, specifically between the ages of 18 to 24 is where we see the highest rates.
Mm.
As many as 1 in 9 men experience very severe intimate partner violence that may result in injury, fearlessness, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And 1 in 4 women have also experienced severe physical violence, including beating, burning, or stalking by an intimate partner. So today in America, there's about 1 million women that have survived being shot at or shot by an intimate partner, or current or former. So it's a pretty big number of people. Within high schools, they find that about 1 in 3 high school students within the past year has experienced intimate partner violence. And if you control that for only physical assault, that number is still as high as 1 in 10 within the past 12 months. So it's very, very common, even among what we often as adults would consider not as serious relationships, that we're seeing that perpetration of domestic violence is occurring at younger and younger ages. Worldwide, I have those stats in front of me, but worldwide it's an even higher statistic and more skewed towards women being victimized worldwide, America by itself.
Can you repeat that last statement? I think it cut out just a little bit.
Yeah, so with the stats we have in America that are already pretty high, when you look worldwide, I don't have the exact numbers in front, but you'll see that the victimization of women jumps even higher when you go worldwide than compared to just America.
Wow. Thanks, Catherine. I think what stood out to me is you said that as high school students and children, we don't consider their relation like we do. You did the quotes because there are people who are like, those aren't real relationships. So can you touch on then the spectrum of the relationships of what that even looks like in terms of how abuse is handled, considered what is considered abuse? How is that, on that spectrum of relationships?
Yeah, abuse and what's considered violence, right?
Correct.
When we talk about violence, what does that include and what does that spectrum look like?
So one of the things that we talk about with domestic violence is it is defined differently depending on what state you're in, what jurisdiction you're in. But the way that I'm going to talk about it today is it is a pattern of control and coercion in which one member of the partnership attempts to gain power and control over the other one. So across the nation, there's varying definitions of what that looks like in law. But from a DV advocate perspective, that's how we're going to kind of define it today. So whereas we often think violence, we think of physical assaults, strangulations, beatings, the black eyes, those kind of things that pop to mind when you hear the word domestic violence. Those are absolutely included, but there's a wide range of what we consider power and control objectives that perpetrators use. So some of these may be controlling finances, ensuring that one partner holds all the debt, or that they don't have access to finances at all, taking one partner's paycheck. It may look like using children, threatening to call Department of Human Services, threatening to divorce and take the children with them, threatening to harm the children in order to control the partner. Isolation is probably the biggest one because most of the other forms of violence depend on the victim being isolated. And this can look like a lot of different things. So for instance, I've worked with women whose abusers have started fights right before they're supposed to go to Thanksgiving. Well, now I don't want to go. I'm embarrassed. Starting fights in front of family and friends so that the victim doesn't want to bring them around, sabotaging relationships. Because as a perpetrator, the more isolated that I could potentially get someone, the more control I have over them. So those strong relationship ties with friends and family, abusers really want to break those down. And sometimes they even form those looking romantic. I just want to spend all my time with you. I just love you so much that I'm just so excited about you. And that doesn't feel bad to hear someone say to you. So there are forms of what we would consider violence and control that really fly under the radar, both for people outside the relationship looking in, and sometimes even for the victim who's experiencing those forms of violence, because they can be displaying care in a way that makes identifying that as abuse a lot more confusing and a lot more difficult for victims.
Catherine, I'm so glad you touched on that because I happen to have what I'll call anxious attachment, right? I really have the need for reassurance. I really like people to ensure that they're telling me these things. Mm-hmm. So it's very common that someone who has either anxious attachment or something of that nature where they enjoy that care and that love and that reaffirming of that's an easy way for someone to be manipulated then because they're hearing, oh, you love me. That's why you want this to happen. Oh, you want me to stay so deeply, so I shouldn't go to those family events because you care so much about me. And that could be a distortion of our own reality, right?
Mm-hmm. And so one of the other main types of abuse that we see is gaslighting, making someone doubt their own version of events and their own reality. In working with victims, overwhelmingly, I hear if physical violence had been the only thing that happened, I would be doing better right now.
Wow.
Violence, those wounds healed, and it was the emotional impact that took a lot longer for victims to move past once they left the relationship.
Can you give an example of gaslighting for people who may have heard this term but don't really understand how that can look and an example of that?
Yeah. So for instance, I was also a victim of domestic violence, a violent relationship for about 4 years. And one of the things that my abuser did at the time that we met, I had been struggling with depression and had been on anti-anxiety meds. And years later, he had spent countless days just sort of chipping away at self-esteem to the point that my emotional reactivity went up. If he picked at me and I didn't explode, it could go for hours. But the moment I exploded, I was guaranteed that it would stop. And one of those explosions occurred at a restaurant. in front of people, in front of a waiter, and made me feel super humiliated at what the decision that I had made to explode in that context. And afterwards, I went to the bathroom to collect myself. When we got home, my abuser framed it as, I think maybe it's time to go back on psych meds. You seem to be really struggling with your mental health. I spoke with all your friends. They're also very concerned. Mm. But for me, that looked like care. I didn't feel like my mental health was struggling because to me, I was just reacting to the things around me. But it really got under my skin of, oh, I am. Maybe that's why I feel so lousy. Maybe that's why I'm crying erratically. Mm. So then that blame of abuse got shifted from the treatment within the home to my mental health. And it was a really effective form of control because to me, it looked like care.
So oftentimes control can look like care.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's such an important statement to like resonate on. And, you know, ultimately we, you know, what kind of like then questions can we ask ourselves to say, is this care or could this be abuse? You know, like how do we differentiate the two and how do they kind of connect into the bigger picture when we're talking about a potentially abusive or domestic violence situation?
Yeah, so when we're looking at a relationship spectrum ranging from healthy to unhealthy all the way down to abusive, it really relies on equity within that relationship. So for example, in a healthy relationship, even if someone was having a mental health concern, there would be an equal conversation of what do you think is going on with you? How do I best support you? This is what I think is going on with you. What do you feel about that? And it's a consistent exchange amongst the partnership. And so if things that are looking like care are coming out, but there's not that equality of the other partner getting to share what they think is going on, what they value, what's important to them, if that's always one-sided, that's an indicator that you're moving more towards unhealthy and potentially into abusive territory.
What a great delineation to make and to understand that when we're talking, you know, because that's one way to think about it is what does a healthy relationship consist of? You know, what are the attributes of healthy relationships, and equity being such an important one to really think about. That are we both able to, you know, mutually contribute? Do both of our opinions matter? Do both of our requests matter in these situations?
Right, because even healthy relationships have conflict. Mm-hmm. Going to agree all the time. So how does that conflict get resolved is one of the biggest indicators. So in domestic violence work, we discuss what we call the cycle of violence, which begins with a phase that we call the honeymoon phase. So you can imagine the honeymoon phase consists of a lot of love, a lot of attention, a lot of affection, really building strong bonds between both parties within the relationship. Now, this first honeymoon period can range from, I've worked with victims where it only lasted a few months. Mine lasted approximately 12 months. And I've worked with some survivors who their first honeymoon period lasted 8 years.
Wow.
So during that time, it's used to strengthen that bond, which makes it it's one of the reasons it's difficult to leave once a relationship has become unhealthy and or violent, is because there's this long stretch of history where the partner was attentive, was affectionate, really showed a lot of demonstrations of love and affection that then create hope within the survivor that things can change. I know we can be a good couple because we were once before. I know we can do it because look at this history that we had where things were fine. So after that honeymoon period, we discuss something called tension building. And there's often not great language around what goes on in this phase. Survivors will tell you they were walking on eggshells. They felt tension. They knew something was coming, but they didn't know when. And so this is where you start to see more of the emotional abuse start to sneak in to the equation. Following this, right, there's tension in all relationships, but the way tension is resolved in a domestically violent relationship is through a phase we call acute explosion. So this is often where intense verbal abuse or attacks can take place. The actual physical assaults typically take place within this phase, but very rapidly, once that phase has concluded, the victim and the perpetrator enter into another honeymoon phase. And so that can be very dislodging for victims to know what ground they stand on, because there's just been this huge explosion and now we're right back in to a very affectionate place.
And why would you say it's difficult to identify that, hey, I've been here before, right? Like, or that this is a cycle, and especially maybe on the second or third round, what are the challenges that exist when you're actually in the cycle in terms of being able to identify it and recognize it as such?
So the first thing is that typically it doesn't happen all at once. So the first round through the cycle, your first acute explosion could look like someone blocking a door frame and keeping a victim from leaving during a fight. That's not what we typically think of when we think of violent assault. And it could be calling someone a very cruel name during the course of an argument. And so usually by using those sort of lesser violent techniques, when we enter into the honeymoon phase for that second time, it really looks like, oh, this problem has been addressed. Happened. However, as you go through it more and more, the tension becomes longer and more intense. The acute explosions can become more violent, and that honeymoon period begins to shorten. And so in some cases, that honeymoon period disappears completely. By the time the victim has chosen to leave the relationship. One good indicator on if a relationship is healthy versus unhealthy versus abusive is, do partners take accountability? So what we often see in the honeymoon phase in the early stages is, honey, I'm so sorry. My anger got out of control. It's never going to happen again. But as that cycle continues, those apologies start to look a little different. I wouldn't have had to do that if you hadn't, fill in the blank. And as that accountability gets moved from the perpetrator to the victim consistently, there's a couple of things that happen. One is nobody wants to believe that they're in a domestically violent relationship. And once you say it out loud, that just makes it true. So for many people, there's a denial, particularly in the beginning, about if this relationship is dangerous or not. The abuse that I've sustained thus far has not been what we would consider typically domestic violent behavior. It wasn't an assault. It wasn't a black eye. It wasn't tackled to the ground. And I have a partner that is voicing that they're sorry. And now we've entered into another honeymoon phase. That second honeymoon phase can last a year. It can last 8 months. And so that really gets the victim comfortable again, thinking that change has actually occurred. When we move that accountability, the other reason it's so easy is if I can make it my accountability, my fault, then I can fix it. I can change it.
Yes.
And so then there's this motivation of change that's levied against the victim of the violence rather than the perpetrator. And what you'll start to see with victims is they will try every combination to get the abuse to stop. Very typically, it's not that they want the relationship to end. They want the abusive components to stop.
Sure.
The honeymoon phase builds hope. It really can get its hooks in that things can change. And it really can psychologically mess with the victim and encourage them to believe that the abuse that they're facing is their fault. We were doing it. We were a good couple. Now we're not. I'm being told it's my problem. So I'm going to take on the role of fixing this. And until they try everything they can think of to get the abuse to stop, that's when they'll start to look at leaving, very typically.
So it sounds like this honeymoon phase, it's very difficult to differentiate between, oh, we worked through our problem and now we're at a better place, and recognizing that, oh no, this is just the cycle starting over again and I've been here before. So you talked about in terms of differentiating honeymoon phase versus working through a problem and kind of growing as a couple together. You mentioned one being accountability, right? So one is who's kind of accepting responsibility for this, or is the blame kind of always being shifted onto, one person? But are there any other things that you feel like are very specific to honeymoon phases rather than couples working through good, being just couples being at a good place and wanting to reconnect and wanting to grow and build together? Is there anything else that you feel like can really differentiate honeymoon phase from working through a problem?
So it depends on how much investment you're getting from the other partner. So if I truly think that I did something wrong and that it's my fault, you will see me motivate to fix it. And again, with that accountability, there's follow through. So just saying, honey, I'm so sorry, I'll never do that again, is not the same as, oh, I'm shocked at my behavior and I'm going to go find my own therapist and work through this. Or what do you need from me for me to rebuild the trust that I just broke with you?
Wow, that was powerful.
That's a great question to ask, or for someone to ask. What do you need from me to rebuild this trust? What can I do? And obviously mentioning therapy and how important therapy is, both as individuals who are coming together in a relationship, but also potentially as a couple in seeking therapy.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to clarify, with therapy for within the context of domestic violence, it's not appropriate to do couples work.
Great distinction.
It puts the victim in a position where if they are open and honest within a therapy room, they might pay for the things that they say when they go home. So if there's been a domestically violent and explosive incident, that perpetrator, if this couple's going to continue to be together and wants to address their stuff, they need to go find their own and work through individual therapy well in advance of putting those partners in a room together, because otherwise it can be very dangerous.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think that is something that naturally you go, oh, we're having problems as a couple, let's go together. And then not feeling like somebody could actually address the concerns that they're, in being truthful and addressing them because they're partners in the room. That's a great distinction.
Catherine, I have a question, and it's going to sound a little interesting because I don't want to put it on, like, it's not my responsibility to ensure that my partner is entering this relationship in a healthy manner and exhibiting healthy behaviors with me, aside from setting beautiful boundaries, calling them out on their stuff. But if in fact, like she said, I do get into this cycle, I do find myself circular and redoing the major components that end up being that domestic violence cycle. Is there something that I can do from a preventative measure, like as a strong, empowered female, if I'm single, if I'm sitting here and I want to start engaging in healthy relationships, is there something that I can do either within myself for me or at the beginning of relationships to sort of either like suss out, like, is this going to be something questionable, or, I've got all my defenses in a safe way where people can still penetrate with love, but not necessarily with manipulation or coercion? Is there something we can do to create that within us?
So one of the things that I like to tell people to do is early on in a relationship, set a boundary that you don't care about all that much. One that's a little bit further out, and gauge how that potential dating partner responds to that boundary. If it's respected, that boundary can always move closer depending on what it is. But if they challenge it, attempt to move it, try and cause guilt trips for that boundary, that's an indicator, right? If they're not going to respect the one that's further out, that's maybe, I don't really care about it.
You mean something like, don't move my plant off the balcony, just leave that there? Like, or are we talking like, don't use my toothbrush? Like what do you mean small boundary? Give me a good.
Like even something, so one thing we see with domestically violent relationships is that there's extreme jealousy pretty early on. So, and that again can look like, I just care about you so much, And so if you're going out for a night with friends and saying, hey, I'm going out, going to be unable to text. Okay, good, have fun, is a way different response than getting a text every couple minutes. Where are you? What are you doing? Are you having fun? Are there any guys there? Right. And so even just little things like that. I'm going to be unable to chat tonight because I've got a family night. Guilted for going and strengthening your other relationships outside of the intimate one? Or is that sort of stuff encouraged? I like to think of relationships as a Venn diagram with overlap, right? There's individual people, they're building something together, but it doesn't become one complete circle. Right. So you should still be able to enjoy your individual interests, pursue your individual passions, build something together, but be supporting the individual parts of each. If you start to feel like you're being asked to sacrifice those kinds of things for the sake of the relationship, that can be an indicator that it's becoming an unhealthy direction.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Catherine.
How often do you see cases where the abuser is actually kind of he's trying to portray, or he or she is trying to portray themselves as a almost as a victim, and like, or as like somebody who needs help, or somebody who just has problems or has trust issues because of this, or like, so how often do you see it where, somebody may actually shift and say, oh, I almost have to be a caregiver for this person because they're incapable of these things. And so they start to allow this type of behavior to happen, or just basically they're not holding them as accountable because they have these beliefs about their capabilities or lack thereof.
I've seen this a lot. And it's a form of manipulation that perpetrators, because everybody has hard times. Everybody within relationships may have a partner that struggles, or the couple may struggle at some point. However, when that struggle becomes the excuse for violence or manipulative behavior, I've often seen domestic violence perpetrators pick up on people with deep senses of empathy, and they really play upon that. Domestic violence perpetrators are professionals at adapting to the person in front of them. So what may work to control and manipulate one person is going to look different. And perpetrators are very good at picking up on what's important to a particular victim and then utilizing those strategies. So with people with a lot of empathy or in caregiver roles, which as women, we've been conditioned to take on more caregiver roles. So that can leave us a little more susceptible to this. I understand where this negative behavior is coming from. They were abused in childhood. They were raised in a domestically violent household. And so now all of a sudden, because I understand where they come from, it moves from understanding to an excuse.
Mm-hmm.
So I always encourage in the high school when I teach, we date people, not projects. So you're your own project.
Wow. Yeah.
Someone can support you in working on yourself. But if you're being asked to correct the actions of others in the past, so whether they had abusive parents, they were cheated on before, we've seen that one a lot. His last partner cheated on him. So now he's really sensitive to believing that I'm not being faithful within the relationship, and I understand where that is coming from. Well, that's not your damage.
Mm-hmm.
That's somebody else's. So really differentiating, what does support look like versus manipulation? With support, you support someone in assisting themselves. With manipulation, all the responsibility is put upon.
Was put upon what?
One party within the.
Yeah, I think it's important that you touched on this, because I think a lot of us, if you even look at children, right? When we're raising kids, parents use a lot of manipulative behaviors to raise their children. So what are children learning from a very young age? Oh, manipulation is how I engage, get my needs met, get what I want done. Perfect. Manipulation and coercion are what parents use on kids. So of course they're going to use it within their relationships in the future. So is that something that we've been able to either identify or help people see? Like, if we can mitigate it at the familial stage, we can mitigate it at interpersonal relationship stages, right?
The one thing that the research has shown is that children who are raised in domestically violent household, whether or not they actually witness any physical violence between parents, are more likely to grow up to perpetrate domestic violence, but they're also more likely to grow up and be victims of domestic violence. So that works in both directions. It normalizes manipulative and controlling behaviors. And it can create this environment where I think that's how I show love, through aggression, through taking what I want, through guilting the other party. And so by instilling things within kids about respectful boundaries, even just thinking of the sort of minimal example of grandparents are over and grandma wants a hug and the child doesn't really want to give a hug.
Yeah.
How many times have we told kids they need to be polite and go give that family member a hug, right? So we just taught them in a very small way that what I want doesn't necessarily matter if somebody else wants something else.
And how often we use guilt to manipulate people, and like, wow, you really let me down, or, or comparison, and so when you grow up or have been exposed, or most of your relationships have had manipulative tactics as a part of the relationship, it's very difficult to differentiate what you said, what is support and what is manipulation, what is care and what is manipulation. And I think that's the hardest thing, is to say, am I being manipulated? Because that's why they're so good at manipulation, because it's really hard to identify what that is. Are there, I know you already touched on a few, but I like just love driving this home of like, what are the questions we can ask to say, is this manipulation? And, you know, to kind of separate, no, this is care, this is support, this is manipulation. And even if you drive the same point home that you already hit, I'm fine with that. I just really want us to be clear, because I think this is so important for us to be able to, you know, assess internally about how we feel. We're really the only person who has the answers to these questions.
So one of the things I like to ask clients is, would you be ashamed to tell someone else about this argument, about this disagreement? Would you want to bounce it off your friends and get feedback? If the answer is no, there's a reason.
Yes.
All relationships have conflict. So if there's something that's creating a feeling of shame within that context, that may be one indicator. Will I willingly tell people what's going on in my relationship? And abusers use this. It's our business. Why are you telling people?
Yes.
Adults, we're supposed to be keeping this between us, and they discourage sharing of details outside the relationship. But people who are excited and committed are very excited to share about their partner and their life with the people around them. And so if there's a barrier for some reason to you wanting to share about your experience with your partner, that may be an indicator. I always also encourage my clients to separate verbal reality from behavioral reality. And what I mean by that is, do your partner's words match their actions? So if they're sorry, what actions have been taken to rectify? If they are taking accountability, what actions came after that? And if you have a difference between what's spoken and what behavior shows, behavior's the real reality.
Great.
So comparing those two things, do their words match their actions? And if they don't, actions are what we're going to believe is truth.
Focus on the actions. What actions have shown that they are actually meaning what they're saying? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm curious, I know that there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about intimate partner violence and domestic violence. What do you think are the most common misconceptions that are important to address?
I think the first one, the one I hear the most, is, if it was so bad, why didn't they just leave?
It's the one we hear all the time.
Yeah. For someone who hasn't been in a relationship, it makes a lot of sense as to why. Because when we're talking about domestic violence, we hone in on what's going wrong in the relationship and what has happened. And that completely neglects that there are huge components of love within domestically violent relationships. That honeymoon phase works wonders for laying that kind of foundational groundwork. Human beings are, by design, we are created to build very strong and lasting bonds biologically. And we are not as equipped to break those down once they're built. So just even from a biological standpoint, we're much more likely to build a relationship and commit to it than we are to kind of try and tear it down brick by brick.
Interesting.
Victims are left with this odd feeling of dissonance in, this person harmed me and I know that that's not okay. And I also still feel affection for this person. So there's something wrong with me, in which case I don't want to verbalize it out loud because I feel shame about it. And we also neglect that victims have very strong feelings for their partners. They may share children, they've shared experience, they've shared life struggles, and all of those seek to build bonds between people. And so there is a very strong bond. Also with that cycle of violence, very slowly and systematically, the survivor's sense of self, sense of knowing what's right or wrong, and sense of self-esteem all start to get chipped away. And so what do I need to make decisions? For myself, I need self-esteem. I need to think that I know how to make good decisions. And by having that undermined for a long enough period of time, then it's even more difficult for me to make decisions about how to escape safely. Studies have shown that the most dangerous time to be in a domestically violent relationship is actually when the victim decides to leave that relationship. So their risk of being killed can actually increase 75% at the time that their perpetrator knows that they're gone. So victims are facing a big challenge of, leaving may actually put me at more risk in the initial, few months to a year than if I actually stayed put. And by slowly gaining more power and control, with interspersed physical violence, the perpetrator creates pretty much a post-traumatic stress disorder within their victim. And when our fight or flight is activated, our brain is designed to shut down higher level thinking. Our brain doesn't care what we're going to, try and study in college if it's not sure we're going to live till dinner. And so what we see over time with these it's very stressful to live in a domestically violent relationship. And they're getting their fight or flight constantly. And so our brain kind of works like a muscle. You activate fight or flight, it becomes very, very, very good at activating. And we start to see cell death in other regions of the brain that are responsible for long-term planning, emotional regulation, those sorts of things. Memory is highly impacted. And fight or flight operates on a second-to-second, minute-to-minute basis. My brain is trying to keep me alive. So if you have a victim who's constantly in fight or flight, which most of them are, their brain is operating from a second-to-second, minute-to-minute standpoint. And you need very careful planning in order to leave a violent relationship safely. So there's a lot of things a constellation of factors that impact how and when and why a survivor of domestic violence will leave. The average amount of times a victim of domestic violence leaves before they leave for good is 7.
Wow.
7 times trying to leave the relationship?
Mm-hmm. And that's the average. For some, it's a lot more than that.
Sure.
Compare it to trying to break a rubber band. You may have someone, domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness amongst women and children in the United States. So many women looking at protecting their children, having a roof and consistent food is better than fleeing and ending up on the street. So it's a lot more nuanced when victims are trying to escape these violent relationships than we often give them credit for.
Yeah. And so I think that's what, not only is it difficult to leave, it's actually dangerous to leave in many cases. And I think that's what a lot of people aren't fully aware of when we talk about domestically violent situations. Now, when it comes to danger, what are there any specific factors or indicators that can tell a survivor or a victim who is currently in a domestically violent situation that this relationship could become fatal?
Yes. So they've done lethality assessments and studies across the country to try and identify certain factors. And many now police departments, sheriff's departments, and victim advocacy centers utilize these to try and inform victims about how much danger they're potentially in based upon some of these factors. So some of the big ones, strangulation is a huge indicator that relationship may become lethal in the future. They've actually found in a recent study in 2008, if a victim was previously strangled by a partner, their risk of dying is about 7 times that of a victim who has not been previously strangled by a partner. And individuals who strangle are also more likely to engage violently with the police than perpetrators who do not. So they're also more lethal to the people around them that aren't their intimate partner than some. Another one, which sounds sort of strange, is threats to harm themselves, threats of suicide. That is a very powerful method of control. If you leave me, I will take my life. And again, putting all of the pressure onto the victim to address this situation. But oftentimes people who are engaging in these sorts of threats don't want to go alone. So if they do follow through with the threat and it's not just words, they may take other people with them. So threats to harm self or others is another lethal indicator. 72% of all murder-suicides in the country were involving an intimate partner. And of those, 94% of the victims were female.
Wow. 72% of murder-suicides were intimate partners.
And when you say that those were predominantly female victims.
Female victims. In murder-suicide, 72% involve intimate partners, and 94% of the victims are female.
94.
Sorry?
94%.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So that is my next question is, are there, misconceptions regarding the genders and the roles that they have in domestic violence? Are there, everyone says, it'll never happen to a man. Men don't get beat up. That's what like is termed around a lot of my friends, let's say. But that's kind of not true.
Yeah, it's not true. We do see that it's a more gendered crime, with men primarily being perpetrators and women primarily being the victims, but those genders can be swapped. And so female perpetrators will sometimes use different forms of coercion and control, playing off of those gender norms. If you call the cops, who are they going to believe? Me or you?
Wow.
If you hit me back, I'm going to call the cops and make sure that you go to jail. So they will utilize sometimes some different forms of coercion and control, playing off of those gender myths. And there's a lot of shame and stigma that male victims face coming forward, particularly if their violent partner was a woman. So it's also understudied because of that shame. Men are less likely to report instances of domestic violence. But however, what we also see is that the more violent episodes are pretty consistently perpetrated by men against female partners. Domestic violence exists in same-sex relationships. Females can be perpetrators. It's in all socioeconomic statuses, class, race, creed. It's present everywhere, but it is more likely to be perpetrated by a male against a female, but that is not.
Thanks for sharing that. I had a thought about something that you were just previously said, so I want to go back to it for one quick moment because I have a personal life experience. You were saying something about how when it's difficult to leave the situation, the honeymoon period, I was in a relationship with someone who basically lied to me for 2 years and told me that we were monogamous, and he actually had an entire family I didn't know about. He was married with children, and I had no idea about this. And when it ended, there was tons of even gaslighting as to what had happened towards the end of it. And again, I was in it for 2 years. So there's some confusion at the end that you said about how you'll question your reality. You'll question what's real and what's not. And what's interesting is I don't recall overt manipulation because I thought he was being honest with me. I thought he was giving me the truth, right? So I don't even recall manipulation, coercion in any way, but I still question my reality at the end of 2 years because how did I not know he had a family? How did I not know he had this whole other existence and that he wasn't being honest with me? So I actually could relate to that idea of like questioning everything, even though I didn't feel like I was gaslit per se, even though I was totally, I was lied to, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious because when you said that, I was like, wait a minute, even though I didn't know it in the entirety of the relationship, like some people know they're in a violent situation, they go through the cycle, they know it's happening and they're living the cycle. I had no conception of it, like no idea. And at the end, I still felt all of the things that you described, which was like, I'm still in love with this person. I still have this idea of hope that, but we can still have but it crashes down.
Mm-hmm.
So how do survivors of these situations, like when faced with all these things, how do they survive? How do they even reconstruct or build back from this moment?
So that's extremely common, that the psychological impacts go for a very long time after the relationship. So in addition to being designed to build lasting relationships biologically, the other component of this is we get automatic responses. Our brains love shortcuts. Can you imagine if every time you had to tie your shoes, you had to think through all the steps to tie your shoes? Our lives would be so hard. And so we're designed to create sort of autopilot responses so that we can put mental energy to other things. And so what can happen in the cycle of violence is as victims get consistently blamed or berated or have their self-esteem crushed, as they're trying to figure out how to fix the relationship, they will try everything. So if during the last argument it was, I walked away, right? I created distance so everyone could calm down and I walked away. And then I was harassed because adults talked about it. And you walked away from me like a child. Okay. So the next round, I stay to talk it out. Well, now I'm being badgering. And so you compound that over the course of years, and the automatic response the victims start to feel is every time I make a decision, the next thing that happens is this sense of, oh no, I made a mistake. I did something wrong. And part of that is a defense mechanism, right? Victims are trying to get violence to stop, but our automatic responses are based on this biological fight or flight minute to minute. And so I work with a lot of clients that have really damaging responses to making choices and a huge array of self-doubt, or their automatic responses to feel guilty, to feel shame, to feel like they didn't do enough. They kind of lose that sense, that inner voice that tells them right from wrong. And so I try and provide some psychoeducation to clients that your automatic response might not be reflective of what's going on around you now. And so just because you feel guilt doesn't make you guilty.
Yeah.
Survival mechanism for you to have tried to get abuse to stop in the past. And just because it's happening now doesn't mean you're guilty of anything now. So let's break down those feelings of guilt. Let's break down these automatic responses and figure out, am I responding to what's going on in front of me, or am I responding to my past?
I love how you tie it to a survival skill that we have. This is our brain actually creating these shortcuts out of survival purposes, but they don't serve us in these situations, right? And now they are, they can create unnecessary feelings of guilt that then make it really difficult to accurately assess your current situation.
What I also tell clients is I kind of compare these domestically violent relationships to a hurricane. When you're in the hurricane, you can't assess the damage that's going on to the house. It's not safe. You can't turn your attention away from your abusive partner because you're consistently learning to adapt to them. Survivors know. It could be a look across the kitchen that no one else picks up on, and it means a great deal to them. And so their focus has to be on adaptation to the violent partner. And only after they leave the relationship, I kind of compare it to, we got to do a damage inventory. Within you got hurt through this experience because so much gets caught up on this survival mode that we don't even think about self-esteem.
Wait, you just said, sorry, you're cutting out, damage inventory. Can you go over that again?
Yeah.
Or how do you take that inventory too? Like, how do you
pen and paper? Let's go. What's the damage inventory? Let's do this.
So in my work as a therapist, I have clients bring to me when they're having their negative feelings. What's going on? Oh, well, someone snapped at me at work and I had to go into the bathroom and cry for several minutes before I could calm down. Well, let's break that down. Is it this person snapping at you? What would you associate with that snap? And only then do they realize that tone of voice was used as a weapon. I could get a text a certain way, I could get a phone call a certain way, and I knew I was in trouble. And so now anytime someone talks to me and their tone reflects that, I go into that space of fight or flight, trying to survive.
Interesting.
And feeling guilty. And that can really play off of when they try and leave relationships too. I try and leave and I feel like I'm the quitter. I'm the one who's not fighting for us anymore. And that really reaffirms all those negative things that partner said about me while I was there. One of the other things I challenge clients to do is when you have those thoughts in your head that are demeaning or damaging, whose voice is it? It might sound like yours, but where did you learn to talk to yourself like that?
That one just hit home for me. Because really, I think in our household in general, me and my daughters, we're all so sensitive to tone. And like everything that, like, even my daughter's like, Mom, you don't have to talk to me that way. And I'm like, I'm just being assertive. But we all are very, for whatever reason, like highly like attuned to what a tone means in different people. And, you know, bless Hedon's heart, he's talking on the mat and like directing people, hey, foot over here, perfect, everything. And then when he comes home and does it to us, we're like, what? We're not on a mat. This is not 3,000 square feet. We're just here. And it's like, he's even realizing, oh, I need to adjust that. But I guess, like you said, who taught us that tone was either okay, safe, not okay?
Well, I think you bring up what kind of resonated with me at this moment is that we're talking obviously a lot about intimate partner relationships, right? But domestic violence also includes parent-child relationships.
Yeah.
And so some of us, you may not have had an intimate partner relationship that created this type of damage inventory that we're taking, but you may have had other relationships, like your relationship with your parents, that have taught you these things, and that now we are, programmed to, I guess, recognize these behaviors or these cycles in our partnered relationships. So I imagine that inventory is so important to take, not just for our romantic relationships, but also for any long-standing influential relationships in our life.
Yeah.
I think then my next question in talking about that is, when someone is in somewhat of an abusive relationship or is in the cycle, how then can either family, friends, or loved ones who are either perceiving this or don't know what's happening, but someone comes to us with this information, how can we either support them? How can we help them? Because sometimes we can also create more damage than good, right?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things is, right, isolation is a huge component. So if you know someone or you think they may be in a violent relationship, maintaining that connection. They may have canceled on 5 girls' nights already. And our response to that is often, oh, we're getting blown off. We're not, about their partner more than they care about their other relationships. Whereas that may also be an adaptation. Abusers may threaten people's family members to them. If you leave, I know where your parents live, sort of thing. And so they may actually be trying to protect the people in their life by distancing themselves. But the more isolation, the harder it is to escape these relationships. And another
I just want to, before you go into the other one, I really want to harp on that for a second, because I think I remember having multiple friendships and people in my life who in our younger years, this happened. And I remember the response of a lot of our mutual friends being like, ugh, she found a guy and now she just, completely left us high and dry. And it was a lot of frustration, and it was a lot of disappointment, and feeling anger towards that person. And so I think it's just an important assessment right now to really think about, are there any friends in your life who you might feel this way, that they left you for a man? And trying to maybe consider, rather than feeling anger about this person, really taking a different approach and saying, wow, are they being manipulated? Are they being coerced into isolation? And is there another way I can support them without kind of feeling let down every time I try to reach out, and just recognizing that it's just throwing a line out every so often.
Yeah. Or do they need support in this new relationship to find out how to continue the bond with me and with their new partner? Because a lot of people aren't equipped to maybe have these multiple bonds of okay, so how do I keep nurturing this relationship and this one? And as you continue to nurture that, you might find, oh, actually, they don't know how to maintain these two relationships, mainly because that one's asking too much of them, or that one's asking these things. So like you said, reaching out is a very beneficial and helpful thing if you know someone who's in that, right?
Yeah. And one thing that makes that hard is if you do know for sure that they're in a violent relationship, knowing that they sometimes take several times to be able to leave before they leave for good. We get a lot of clients at our agency that when we ask about their support systems, they said they don't want to hear from me until we're divorced, or until this happens, they're done with me. And so not only has the perpetrator isolated them, but because of the frustration and pain that loved ones go through watching it happen, sometimes they self-select and isolate the victim further. While it's understandable that frustration, that feeds back into that cycle of violence of, now I don't have supports outside this relationship. I don't have supports I can reach out if I need help fleeing. And it's also really common that when people get into a new relationship and they get excited, that they do neglect friend relationships. So it's not a necessarily absolute red flag. But one of the things I really like to ask people about, just get curious about the relationship, non-judgmental, not accusatory, just, oh, tell me about it. Tell me about him. Would you guys want to go on a double date together? Inviting that person in to get your own assessment, but also show I'm here to support you, whatever that looks like. Now, if you know they're in an abusive relationship, you don't have an obligation to support that relationship, but continuing to support that individual. You don't have to be happy that they're with the perpetrator, but you don't want to shut off that avenue of support should they ever need it.
Catherine, I think you hit such a big topic from a lot of the friend groups that I also was raised around. And it was very much well, I keep telling her he's not good for her. And they have all the list of judgments are so long that the woman, like you said, or the partner who's trying to maybe even find her common ground, doesn't even feel safe with her friends anymore. So now I don't feel safe with my partner, but I'm in love with them and it's a weird bond. And now I don't even feel safe with my friends. Right. So it's like abandonment from all angles. And of course, and they're going to stay with at least that person who at least has highs and lows, but they at least have highs at some point of good, you know? Yeah. So that makes sense that maybe from a friend perspective, we can say, hey, listen, I'm going to take some space to support you, but I'm always here for you. You know, just know that I need space because I don't want to support that relationship, but I support you and I love you always. And if you ever need some place to go to, I'm here. So is that a viable way to support them? Because we also don't want to say like, go girl, I love that guy if we don't love him, right?
Yeah, no, you don't want to, because that can also be used, right? So if domestic violence perpetrators were easy to identify, I wouldn't have a job, which I would be okay with in this context, but we know that they're not easy to identify. And so some of them play upon being well loved and well respected within the community or within other friend groups. So if you do say, oh, I love him, he's great, even if you don't believe that, that perpetrator may also use that. Who's going to believe you? Like my perpetrator worked for a nonprofit, did a lot of really good work within the community, was in a master's program. And so that was something that kept me, was no one's going to believe that this sort of person in public does this kind of things when we get home.
They did it with children, actually. That's what molesters, people who want to take advantage of children, they say that to kids. No one's going to believe you because you're a kid and I'm the adult. And that's why I actually tell my kids, I will always believe you. I will always hear your side of the story. I will always take action when needed. And I think we need that with our friends as well.
We absolutely do. Yeah. That non-judgment and that
full
constant,
support.
like full support.
I will believe what you say and it will hear you as your truth, period.
So I know that, like, I know it's always hard. It's so difficult for people who love somebody and want to support somebody who's in a violent relationship or an abusive relationship. But how far do we go in terms of that support? Like, do we tell them, to leave? Do we give them our thoughts on what they should or should not do? What does that support look like? And what are the things that, like Victoria said, can potentially actually create more damage or more isolation in our attempt to help?
Yeah. So I would avoid why questions for the most part, because why are you staying? Why would you be with someone like this? Right now, I feel crappy about myself with these whys. And oftentimes the multiple forms of abuse, people who are in those relationships don't identify anything as abuse with the exception of those physically violent episodes. When you're talking to a friend or a loved one, giving examples, hey, I'm a little concerned about this because it seems like when you argue, he uses a lot of really cruel language towards you. I didn't attack him. I didn't say he's a bad person. I said, my concern is you're being susceptible to this sort of name calling, right? I gave an example, asking, hey, what's it like when you guys disagree? How do you guys solve your disagreements? That can tell you a world about a relationship. It's not charging and saying, I think you're being domestically abused, right? That's a really big label for someone else to put on a relationship who's not within it, but giving more of those specific examples. Hey, I notice whenever we're out together, he texts and calls you a lot. How do you feel about that? Are you okay with that? What are those conversations like, right? It's just genuine interest and then highlighting the components that you're worried about without necessarily labeling the relationship, labeling the person, but still kind of teasing out those forms of abuse, because many victims don't know that outside of that physical violence that it counts.
And then when they come back with kind of like an excuse for them, or, he's just really jealous because his last relationship, she cheated on him. And so now he's always reaching out, but it's all good. Like somebody who makes an excuse for their partner. How do we kind of respond to even that level of excuse making, or how do we just kind of throw it out there? Like, still not feeling comfortable about this, without again, telling them what to do.
So again, I think it's just reiterating concern, right? I understand that maybe he's, had infidelity in his past relationships, but you don't deserve to pay for that. And letting victims know it's not their fault, because outside of public, they're being told very consistently that what's happening to them is their fault and their responsibility. So any sort of counteracting that, that's why those why questions also imply blame. And the victim in the relationship is already getting all the blame. And so really hitting home, it is not your fault. I don't agree with the way that you're being treated, and I love you. So I'm probably not going to invite him to barbecues at my house, but should you ever need a place to stay, should you ever need, right? I don't have to support the relationship. I just have to support the person, and keeping those avenues of communication open, or saying, okay, so that, you know, in the instance of infidelity in past relationships, oh, that really sounds like maybe he has some things he needs to work on. Is he seeing a counselor about that? Is he doing kind of identifying, yes, he may have damage. Everybody brings their own baggage to a relationship, but what is he doing to tend to that damage versus asking you to tend to that? And just really accountability and those behavioral actions that show accountability.
Now, what if somebody actually has experienced violence and they come to you and they have either, you know, some markings on their body that's very clear that a situation has already become violent. And I guess specifically what I'm kind of wanting to address is, I know that some people may be inclined to like call the police on their behalf or to almost do something on their behalf. And what is your stance in terms of, again, with the ultimate objective being keeping this person safe? What do you think, what options does a supporter of this person have in terms of what they can do to help keep them safe?
So the first thing I would recommend is trying to have a conversation with that person outside of the context of their perpetrator, where they can speak freely should they want to. Text message, not always a good idea. Facebook Messenger, those kind of things, because you can't guarantee if that perpetrator is monitoring their devices or their communications.
Right.
And inviting them for like, hey, let's go. I haven't seen you in a while. Let's go get coffee on Wednesday. Just trying to get them away from their perpetrator in something that doesn't look like, hey, I need to talk to you about the domestic violence that you're facing at home. Mm-hmm. And then asking the question, what do you think would help keep you safer? Because for some, especially if they have a history of police responding to the house and no action taken, that may put them in more danger. You told someone, you did something. And we can't control their safety once they leave our space. So making offerings. Here's the number to the local domestic violence agency. I'd recommend everyone just has that in their cell phone for whatever region that they live in. I can call them with you. We can go down there and sit and let's just talk to an advocate. Domestic violence agencies do not report domestic violence to law enforcement without the consent of victims, with the exception of child abuse. So there's avenues where they can talk things out with a trained advocate in order to sort of suss out, am I in a violent relationship? Am I in an unhealthy relationship? And what's my risk? And so just knowing what those local resources are and connecting victims to them and giving them the power to make a decision and providing some education. Hey, I know it's really hard to look at leaving a relationship where you love somebody. Chances are they do love that person, which is why charging in and throwing blame and name games against their partner can really backfire, because there is a strong bond between those individuals. And even those violent episodes with all the hormones that they dump also seek to kind of reinforce connections even during violent episodes, because it becomes this sort of trauma bonded experience.
So I love this. And you just mentioned it. So I want to, if you can give us maybe a few options. You said that when someone comes to the agency will ask them questions. So what questions can we ask ourselves or anyone who's watching to kind of determine whether we've been in an abusive relationship in any way, shape, or form, if it wasn't overtly physical?
So I would look at things such as, did my partner value my decision-making, right? Decision, do I feel confident that I can do that? If I have a voice in my head telling me that I'm stupid, that I'm not worth anything, that I'm never going to get somebody else, that I'm somehow more unworthy than any other individual around me, that's an indicator that someone has decimated my self-esteem. Mm-hmm. Do I find myself walking on eggshells around my partner? Even just if no physical violence has ever occurred, do I get that gut feeling of I'm in trouble or I'm in danger? if I do make a mistake within my relationship, am I filled with fear at having to acknowledge that mistake? Because if fear is present, we've got something else going on. Right? We're all going to mess up. I come to my partner and say that. Or am I at risk of something? Can be an indicator. Really, was I valued? Was I valued as a partner? Were my contributions valued? For instance, do I have any sort of what would look like PTSD to anybody else responses? So for me, my partner would constantly nitpick at me in the kitchen, guilt me for not contributing enough, utilizing gender roles to make me feel guilty about working and not providing enough at home. I would go out of my way to fix that and contribute more at home. It would be constantly berating how I made things, if I was a good cook, if I wasn't, throwing food in the garbage that I had just made. And that became such a normal part of my life that in a future relationship, I had a boyfriend that just peeked into a pot to see what I was making. And I had a completely explosive, get out of here, get away from me, like just a complete freak out that left me wondering why I was crazy. And then when I started to do that damage inventory, I realized that's how I got him to stop. In the past was exploded. And now it takes very little for me to explode. So am I having reactions to things that are making me feel crazy? Because domestic violence makes victims feel like they're the ones that are crazy. Between the gaslighting and the emotional abuse, catching someone cheating and then having them blatantly lie to your face, no. Oh, honey, you're wrong. And it's so nerve-wracking to be in an altercation like that, where you do start to feel like, clearly, with evidence, no one should be denying this, but it continues to happen. And now I'm wondering if I really am nuts. Did I misinterpret this text message? Did I do these things? So if you're left feeling crazy after interactions, that's a good indicator that emotional violence has been being perpetrated against you if you feel very unstable on the ground that you're standing on.
That hit home.
I know.
Okay.
I'm like, going to go back and take a bunch of notes throughout this whole thing. This is so valuable.
Oh
Such
my
incredible
gosh.
conversation. Now, ultimately, I really want to make sure that we touch on if somebody believes that they are currently in an abusive relationship, what resources are out there for them? What steps can they take? And, how do we help somebody basically help themselves, or what kind of planning can they start to look into in terms of exiting the relationship, and what might that look like?
Yeah, so I would always encourage people to find your local domestic violence response agency. Almost everywhere has one. It may not be in your county, it may be in a neighboring county, but there's very typically some agency that's dedicated to supporting domestic violence survivors. And they help with what we call escape planning or safety planning. What are the barriers to exiting this relationship safely? And how do we identify resources to address those barriers? So for instance, I worked with a victim whose child needed medication daily. And her perpetrator would give her exactly 1 dose a day and keep the rest of the medication locked up, understanding you're not going to leave without this medication. And so as part of her safety plan, she had to start carving off just a small amount of medication off of each of those pills every day until she had what she thought was at least a week's worth. And then I can go, because I can get to another doctor, I can get more meds, but I need a week. And so safety plans are as individual as the relationship and the person. And those advocates are trained to help identify those and say, okay, this is how we're going to safety plan you out of here. Many of them also operate shelters where women and children specifically, and most will serve men as well, can flee if the home is so dangerous that they don't believe that they can stay within the same home safely. Some of these options are specific to states. So in the state of Colorado, victims can file for a civil protection order that can order the abuser out of the home. There doesn't have to be criminal charges. They go in front of a judge. There's a process, but it may result in them being allowed to stay within their home and excluding the perpetrator from that. And your advocates at these domestic violence agencies know the laws for each state and know what resources are available state to state for victims of domestic violence, depending on the agency.
Right. And I know that there are also national hotlines. Do those national hotlines help you locate can they help you locate a local agency?
Yep. So you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and they have all of the agencies for the United States. And based on your geographic region, they can hook you up with the closest one to you.
And we're going to put that in the show notes afterwards. So we'll make sure that all of these resources are there.
Yeah.
And Catherine, can you tell us a little bit about Uncaged Today and how this plays a role and how self-defense plays a role in healing for survivors of violent crimes?
Absolutely. So Uncaged Today is a local nonprofit. The mission statement is equipping women and young girls with the confidence to live a life of freedom by offering prevention, healing, and empowerment through self-defense training. This was really born out of, it started as a prevention program for victims who had already experienced domestic violence or sex assault to prevent them from future victimization. That is one of the risk factors to being identified by a perpetrator for domestic violence is previous instances of domestic violence or sex assault, because we know that those also ruin victim self-esteem, really make it difficult to enforce boundaries. And so you'll see a lot of people in these systems that have multiple victimizations across their life. And so what started out as a prevention, once we got to working with victims, we also saw this is a huge opportunity for victims to also regain some strength and control in a more healing capacity. So sexual assault is a huge component. Very often the women that have been domestically abused have also been raped within the context of that abuse. And I can think of no other real situation where you get to work through physical triggers of an attack in a controlled environment. So for a lot of victims, strangulation is very difficult. Just even having someone mounted on top of them in a self-defense setting can be very triggering. And so by enabling in this controlled environment, those victims to work through triggers, they get to address physical triggers that they don't have an organic way to work through. If my, trigger is being strangled, well, hopefully that's not happening to me at work. Hopefully that's not occurring again in other contexts, but I still have this trauma trigger that now is just going to sort of be trapped within my body for who knows how long. And so we offer this space where it's incremental and victims can overcome their physical triggers that they may not have another avenue. For some victims, if someone went up and wrapped them around in a hug, right, they think, their new partner thinks they're showing care. And this causes a huge traumatic response because the last time someone hugged me like that, it was to pick me up and throw me on the ground.
Yeah.
And so just in how unique self-defense training is at presenting violent content in a way that they can manage is really important. The other thing that Uncaged has really focused on is helping victims regain that voice. So we call them restorative experiences. It doesn't take a lot of damaging experiences to ruin a positive experience. So for some, setting boundaries is really difficult in part because they've never been respected. And so again, we have a mental loophole of protection where if I put the boundary out there and it gets violated, I have to deal with the damage of another violated boundary. If I don't put it out there, I've now created a mental loophole that even though I may sustain more damage, I didn't have the boundary violation. And so every time we engage with our girls, there's a culture of, hey, I'm going to put my hands on your neck for this choke defense. What amount of pressure are you okay with? Do you want me to put hands on shoulders instead? And even girls who've worked together for months, every day ask that question before they move forward, because we know the more they can say out loud, this is what I'm okay with, this is what I'm not, and have that respected, it's a restorative experience. And that voice starts to become louder, and they integrate that into their life in way more context than just self-defense training. And those boundary setting things become easier. I'm okay saying them out loud because I now know that the people around me are going to respect them. And if they don't, I now have this cool set of skills to enforce them in a much more direct way.
Catherine, what you said to me that really sticks out, and I cannot love it enough, is that for people who don't feel comfortable setting boundaries. They make this mental loophole to say, if I don't set it, then I won't be disappointed when it's not met. This is such a good insight as to why so many humans don't want to set boundaries from the moment they were a child, even if they set boundaries with their parents. I don't want to hug you. I don't want to hug them. I don't want to do that thing. And that was, again, trampled on. So you do have to have this survival mechanism to create a mental loophole. And that's almost, I want to say to anyone watching, there's forgiveness here in yourself. When you've allowed people to trample boundaries your whole life, I know guilt and shame had come up for me for years when I realized, oh my gosh, I'm a doormat. Oh my gosh, I'm letting everybody do everything all around me. Why? And I realized it was because, boom, I was creating mental loopholes. Catherine, this is so forgiving for so many of us who feel inadequate to set the boundaries, not capable of it, or undeserving, or scared
to set boundaries.
And so part of that, to say it is reprogrammable, to set those small boundaries now and have somebody you love and care to say, hey, can I grab your neck? How much? This can be rewritten in our mental mind space. Our neurology can be reprogrammed to be accepting of these boundaries, guys. Boundaries is our favorite thing. So
it's our favorite word.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. Was such a crucial note for me. So thank you for expressing that.
And I think that hopefully just kind of ties everything into about these corrective experiences that you're talking about. Because I think that a lot of people who have experienced abuse or abusive relationships think, well, I'm broken. And now how am I ever going to have a healthy relationship ever again?
Yeah.
So I can say it, but I don't know if they'll believe me as much as they'll believe a professional. So I want you to
You're a professional in other realms.
Yeah, I know. But like that it's possible to rebuild, that it is possible to have corrective experiences and to build healthy relationships, even when
and safe ones.
And safe, healthy relationships, that is possible for anyone, regardless of your past.
Yes, and it absolutely is. So we see it all the time in our work, and it's pretty incredible. And one other thing that happens with these corrective experiences, it takes very little to adapt to danger. We are biologically designed to survive, and so we can adapt to danger like this, but we can't necessarily adapt to safety as quickly. And so a lot of victims blame themselves. I should be okay. I should be fine. I should be doing this. And it's not. You are designed to survive, and you adapted to a very dangerous situation. And it's going to take some time and intention to adapt you back to safety. It's not that it can't be done, but it often takes longer than the damage took. And that's just because your brain wants better safe than sorry. I often say that my survivors, you could drop them into a war zone and they'd be pretty good. They know how to assess threat. They know how to read body language. They know how to read tone of voice, but it's putting them in a grocery store, somewhere that's not dangerous. Their brains are still detecting threat. Their brains are still scanning for potential danger. And that's where that distress comes from, is trying to move forward and trust that the things around you are safe. And that's not going to happen overnight. And it just takes a little bit of intention, that damage inventory, and then addressing that damage, but your brain will adapt back towards safety. And it is, in terms of the,
that gave me chills.
Your brain can adapt back to safety. Say it again and again and again and again.
And it will adapt back to safety. Just sometimes it takes a little more intention. It'll automatically adapt to danger. We don't have to help it in those ways we're doing. But trusting that the things around you are safe is a whole other ball game. And so I always tell victims, don't should yourself. There's nothing that you should be doing. And most of their responses afterwards can be directly tied back to some sort of survival mechanism, right? So what worked for you while you were in the relationship may still be happening, right? It's about finding new tools for this new situation because that helped you survive. And now we're going to try and help you move from surviving to thriving. And those strategies will look different. And it's not about judging the strategies you used in the relationship to keep yourself alive. It's about getting new strategies to help you adapt back to safety. And so really trying to take the judgment piece out of it is extremely important. The other thing that the self-defense stuff can do is it provides survivors a way to kind of reenact the trauma with a different outcome, right? I didn't have these tools at the time that I was harmed, or maybe I was on drugs or alcohol and I was incapacitated at the time I was harmed. And so I just used the tools that I had, right? And if they're sitting in front of you, the tools they had worked. And now it's about building those new tools. And within the self-defense spectrum, victims are given an opportunity to replay their assaults with different outcomes. And so does that change the reality? No, but it does provide kind of a cathartic healing experience for them to come in when they're frustrated and angry and wail on a kick pad. Wail and cry on a kick pad. I don't care, right? It's about, because the other thing is expressing emotions within the context of domestic violence is dangerous. Mm. If I cry and break down, I may expose myself to more emotional abuse. If I get angry, I may be physically assaulted. And so victims are also used to holding back emotional responses. And so giving them a way to allow that energy of those emotions to flow through them and get that cathartic output can also be really healing for them ultimately.
Oh, this is so good. And we're so proud of the work that you are doing, both you and everyone at Cañon City, at Gracie Jiu-Jitsu Cañon City. So where can people who are listening find more information, both from you and about the work that you're doing? And I kind of want to just put this out there that I think that there are people that go, I want to be able to make the same impact that you guys are making, whether it's through jiu-jitsu, right? Through teaching jiu-jitsu with this kind of, trauma-informed approach that you guys have in helping people heal. But also just recognizing that we can create a community of support for people who are going through these really traumatizing relationships in their life. So can you give people a little bit of guidance as to where to find you and find more information about this process?
Yeah, so you can find the Combat Zone and Gracie Jiu-Jitsu Cañon City are both on Facebook, and you can reach out to us through our Facebook pages. Uncaged's website is uncaged.today. You can always go there to get more information, donate. You can contact us through the site. The agency I work with is Family Crisis Services in Colorado, and I can provide that phone number for notes so that if people have further questions, they can always reach me at my office. And I wanted to share with you guys, before I get to what potentially self-defense instructors can do, I asked one of our current Uncaged girls to write what she wished other people knew about domestic violence. Mm-hmm. I would really like to read that if you guys are up for it.
Please do.
Okay. She says, for me as a victim of domestic violence and being a part of Uncaged and Women Empowered, it has given me the confidence to once again stand for what I believe in, which looks like this. Oftentimes, more than not, the system labels us as victims, and we are continually labeled as such. But in Women Empowered, we are taught that we are women who have power to overcome being a victim. We have tools, right? Well, then alongside these tools, we have our voice to stand up in the legal system and demand that it's not just us as victims that need help. More so, it is our abusers that need help in order to stop the cycle. They need to be mandated to therapy and treatment, just like sex offenders. And we as victims need to understand and learn to use that system to demand the justice we deserve, not to accept and try and move on. We are learning strength, both mentally and physically, by Women Empowered. So let's take that strength one step further and fight like the women with power for true justice, not only for us as victims, but past victims and attempting to prevent future victims. So that's what she had.
I can already vibe she's about to cry. So let me take this on. I caught myself about to get teary-eyed, but then I felt her. And so I shifted into the empathetic hold space state.
Yes.
As I normally do. First of all, I'm so grateful that you shared that with us. That is not only how we feel about our system and everything that we've done, but how we believe every woman can tap into this and use this program and the programs around us to heal, grow, and empower from the situations around us. We do not build the systems we are raised into, but we can absolutely morph them to benefit us better. So thank you so much for sharing that. Thank her for sharing her vulnerability and the strength to write something that is now out and open. And I hope that was healing for her in every way. That was powerful. Do you want to have anything?
Really powerful. Yeah. You summed it up beautifully.
I'm here for you, girl. I got you.
No.
Catherine, it is such an honor to have you on Women Empowered Live with us, having your expertise. And I know that expertise does not come with just studying out of a book. I know that you experienced deep trauma and huge growth on your own. So know that when we asked you to come on this, it was such a privilege for us to really take not only your insight, but your life experience into our hearts and to our platform. And I am so grateful that you were here to share everything that you did. We're so grateful for all the insight on intimate partner abuse and the ways that we can help people survive and even identify ourselves. We're grateful.
We are just so grateful. We knew that this was not a topic. This is such an important one, but it's one that is so deep and so complex that it really takes somebody who is so immersed in both in the healing experience and working and an advocate for survivors like yourself to really have an in-depth conversation. And I know we didn't cover everything. I think that there's still more that we could potentially
endless. We could be
address.
here for hours with you.
We could be, but I really hope that our viewers at least got a deeper understanding to what this looks like, both for them and to ask the right questions for themselves, and to also potentially be a support system that is needed for people in their lives who may be experiencing violence or abuse within their relationships. So thank you guys
for having me. This was awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you all for tuning in this week for Women Empowered Live. We'll see you next week.
See you next week. Bye.